Welcome, good evening to another Edgar Cayce On series, this one being Edgar Cayce On Edgar Cayce, or the past lives of Edgar Cayce. And we always have a disclaimer when to get started so that you know that this is my investigation, my research into the Cayce readings to give you the information tonight. So this is not saying that the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce organization back in Virginia Beach, is saying this is the exact right thing. It's the gospel according to John Schroeder that you'll be getting this evening. So I want to make sure that you understand that, and that I invite you to be able, if you email me, I will send you all of the information or the readings that I use for being able to come up with tonight's topic. Believe me, if you're a note taker, you are going to have lots of names and reading numbers to take down. Let me start here with let you know that Cayce for himself gave 212 readings. And so most of them were asking, I was surprised, he was actually a fairly frail guy. Almost everything he had in his readings, I want to say 99, 98% of his readings were about either health or dream interpretation. So the ones I'm concentrating on tonight are just a handful of them on past lives. So I really, if you were to read the Cayce readings on his past lives, there's a lot of scant, even confusing information that comes up on this. And so some of this is pieced together from his readings. A lot of it is pieced together from other people's readings that coincided with his past lives. And then there was a book called Intimates Through Time. Ooh, I'm going to move out of camera for just a second to grab. Well, I thought I had it. I'll get to edit that out. I thought I brought it with me. Intimates Through Time by a gentleman by the name of Jess Stern. You probably have heard that name if you're familiar with The Sleeping Prophet. Back, I believe, in 1966, that became a bestseller, and it was really put Cayce on the map back there in the 60s. Anyway, he wrote a book on his past lives and did past life regressions on a lot of these people to be able to piece in a lot of the information you're going to hear here this evening. Now, here's something that's a little confusing. It confused me when I was reading it because it sounded like it said Cayce only had 7 past lives on the earth before he came back as Edgar Cayce. And then the more I went back and read it in context, I realized, no, what he was saying is that there were 7 past lives that he had that had the greatest influence on the current life as Edgar. Okay, so when I'm talking about 7 past lives, it's not just talking about the past lives that he had in total. It was the 7 lives that had the greatest impact on the current life as Edgar Cayce. He was born in March 18th, 1877, died January 3rd, 1945. So he's in the mid to late 60s when he finally passed away. Without further ado, I should warn you right now, if you have young ones in the room, there's lots of sex in this thing coming up because Edgar had an ongoing challenge with trying to not interact with people of the opposite gender when he was in his many lifetimes. And we'll get into that in deeper detail as we come up, but just trying to let you know, yes, and it always helps to have that in the beginning of your talk because, you know, especially on YouTube, hello at home, on YouTube, you have all sorts of people that tune in the beginning, and then all of a sudden you lose them very quickly. And now I've been able to say sex, so they'll hang in there with me a whole lot better. All right, we're going to start with the first one, and I'm going to take these in chronological order. We have an Atlantis incarnation that was, as you can see up here, at 50,000 before Common Era, or BC, as Azul. That was the name that was given to this particular lifetime. And the reason this one was so important is because up until that time, he and one other soul were considered what are called soulmates. And that has a whole different definition. I won't get into it in any great detail, but soulmates is not what you think where it's just one perfect soul is made for you to go through eternity with as your companion. No, we're all supposed to be soulmates in that sense. But soulmates in this case is they were of one mind, one ideal. It's almost like they were thinking with one brain. I think that's a joke in a movie I saw once. Anyway, you're seeing the 2 soulmates right here in the picture in the bottom corner, that being Edgar Cayce on the left, and that being Gladys Davis Turner, who wound up being his stenographer on the right. Now, if you are unfamiliar with Edgar Cayce and you're going, was he married? And I'll say, yes. Did that cause problems? Well, you betcha. And you're going to get to see that through the rest of the lifetimes that come up. So these two were soulmates in that particular incarnation, so much so that the body that they came into as a soul was one body. And the two souls were occupying that body together. And it was in that incarnation, if you'll read the reading right there, I don't have to read the whole thing for you, but as a matter of fact, that's just an excerpt that lets you know that when they came in, they were one of the first of the souls that were able to separate out into the genders, male and female. And as you can see, it's talking about becoming, with the associations, the envy of many. People said, say, that looks like fun, okay? So they wound up coming in. The soulmates were able to go into the male and female bodies and were in a leadership position at that time. And it kind of got everybody going, well, now we have a male and a female and we're ready to rock and roll. And therein starts all of the carnal forces and experiences and challenges that Cayce wound up having with the other people that you'll see are the players in his life from that point on. Now, the thing I want, and by the way, these are not actual pictures of Atlantis except in people's minds. This one's obviously, from underwater right now, and that's a somebody's idea of what Atlantis would have looked like back in, its heyday at the time. But that's not saying, a lot of the pictures you're going to see here, you're going to recognize are artist depictions of what's going on, rather than saying I was able to pull these out of the Akashic Records someplace. So please don't hold me to that one. But I do want to say that Cayce's timeline is that we came and we're projecting our minds into the earth plane when we first came in as souls. We didn't have to come in through the birth canal like we do right now into a physical body. But the other thing to keep in mind is that we were able to come in and see what it was like. And remember, people say, hey, I remember being a bird or an animal or a plant or something like that. And in fact, back in those early times, we were able to do that, to project our consciousness into all kinds of life forms in order to see what that was like. The problem is that when you do that, you tend to forget who you are. And herein we don't remember who we are, and that's why we keep coming back into these bodies to figure it out. That's for another topic, but I did want to at least give you the background of how we got to this point. So 50,000 BC. Now we're going to move forward. And notice this is 11,000 years BC, and it's an Egyptian lifetime, and he came into the lifetime with the name Ra-Ta. He later shortened that to Ra. I don't know, how many of you have ever worked with numerology? Okay, a few of you. And if you were to do the numerology on Ra-Ta compared to Ra, you have taken a 2 and gone to a 1. All right, and so he literally shortened the name from Ra-Ta to Ra as a numerological sequence to be able to put more power into not only his name, but his entire life and his life purpose. Now, in this case, Ra started over as Ra-Ta in Atlantis. Now, this is right, if you know the timeline, this is right when Atlantis was very close to going down, when you do the count of 1, 2, 3, and they sink under within that last 1,000 years before it finally went under. And Ra-Ta fled Atlantis to go to Egypt. And he said, we got to start all over again. When you went to Egypt at that particular time, they were, cavemen compared to where Atlantis was. I think the term they use in the readings there is aboriginal. All right, so he wanted to go into this aboriginal land called Egypt and be able to take the technology and the things that he knew from Atlantis and bring it over into Egypt. And believe me, that's where they're all, all of the archaeologists go back there and go, I have no idea how they went from being cave dwellers and just kind of scratching stuff, with a charcoal stick on the wall to being able to build the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. Well, this is a good answer to that. So when you're talking about Ra coming over to be able to do that, it came up, and Cayce calls, there are two places, one that was called the mystery schools altogether, and that's what you're talking about with the Great Pyramids, but you also had something that was called the Temple Beautiful and the Temple of Sacrifice. This is another place where it indicates in the readings that Cayce started to get a little off kilter. Remember when I said we could come in with our consciousness and project our minds into beings that were already here? we could also create beings. And so when you go back into our mythology, and the mythology starts talking about things like centaurs and minotaurs and Cerberus and all of the mythological creatures of the past, they literally have a basis in reality, in that we could say, I'm just going to mess with the DNA until I come up with what I want to do. And they were able to do that at that time. Well, one of the things that comes up is that you had a lot of people who are just monstrous. I mean, it's not only giants, as even the Bible talks about, but monstrous as far as they would have tails, they would have feathers, they were things that were not human at all. And Cayce winds up being a little impatient, is what I will say at this point. Impatient as in wants to come in, temple sacrifice, would literally be able to do surgery. You could do it through healing to a certain extent, but surgery to be able to remove a tail or feathers or things like that. And that was literally what was going on back in the temple of sacrifice and the temple beautiful. The other thing that happened in that time is that Cayce was able to develop chambers that you would go into and literally re-energize and renew the physical body. In other words, you'd walk in looking old and you'd come out looking young. And it didn't happen in like 5 minutes. It would take months in order to be able to do that. And there was a strict program of prayer, meditation, working with vibrations and crystals, special diets, exercise, and the whole thing. But he was able to live a very, very long time. Alan, do you know how long he lived?
No, I don't.
It's hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So he was able to continually renew himself. And so that's the background of getting into the fact that people started calling him a god, because it seems like he didn't die. He wasn't a god at all. That was just how he was able to do that. Now you're getting a picture here. You remember you saw Edgar Cayce here, and you have Gladys Davis Turner here. You have Gertrude Cayce, his wife, here. So you're able to see all three of them, and you're going to see how their lives start to intertwine, especially right here. Now, with this picture over here, this is actually somebody's depiction of what they thought Ra looked like. And this is a picture of Isis. His wife, in that incarnation, that was Isis. So if you've been hearing of the sun god Ra and Ra's wife Isis, there is literally, those two people are it, according to the Cayce readings. I'm going to get to a moment here when we start getting back into the sex. Oh, my ratings just went up on YouTube. Get into the sex, where these two, Ra and Isis, had the daughter Iso, which wound up being Gladys Davis Turner in that particular life. Now, here's how that wound up coming about. Edgar was trying to keep, as Ra, was trying to keep everything on the up and up. He goes, okay, we're going to have the temple of sacrifice, we're going to have healing prayer. And suddenly they started moving into, boy, I hate to say it because it starts to sound like Joseph Mengele in the Nazi times, but trying to perfect the human body. And doing that by selection of the most perfect humans to be able to create a unblemished race out there. Now, Cayce set up his whole hierarchy within the mystery schools, and the people that were working within the mystery schools started to use that as, hey, I like the way she looks. I think I'm going to create a child with her. And so Cayce started saying, wait a minute, we're getting a little far afield of trying to create a unblemished race here. You guys are using this for your own selfish pleasures. And that really upset them, to the point where they all planned to do something really awful. And that is, they said, you, as Ra, need to hook up with this perfect woman named Isis. Now, guess what? Isis happened to have been the favorite, if you will, of King Ararat. You probably heard of him as being part of the Ramsey dynasty. Okay, so if you ever hear of Pharaoh Ramsey, you're also talking about King Ararat being within that time. And that, by the way, in the current lifetime, I ran out of place to put pictures, but that is his oldest son, as Edgar Cayce was Ra's son. Back in that time was King Ararat, or not his son. His son is Edgar Cayce. Back then was the king, or the pharaoh of Egypt, and he was the spiritual leader. So you had the political leader and you had the spiritual leader, and the political leader's favorite was the one that all of these people that were plotting against Ra tried to get them to hook up together. When they did, you can't imagine how upset that made the king. He got so upset, he drop-kicked Rata and all of his faithful followers out of the country, said, go make it on your own for a while. Now, that upset a lot of people, and in both directions. So it was not good. As soon as that happened, things were not going well within Egypt. Things started to go backwards. And eventually, I think it took 9 years in which they were able to go ahead and make amends and bring Rata back into the picture again, and once again become the spiritual leader. But you'll see this one quote that I have down here. It's Cayce when he was looking at all of his past lives, and he says, when the devil can't get to a man, he sends a woman. And he ran into this over and over and over again. So we wind up, if you're talking about a couple of things that were challenges, one was the impatience of trying to go out there and surgically, et cetera, trying to make the perfect human race instead of allowing one generation after another and doing it through healing prayer to be able to get all of the stuff that wasn't quite human out of the gene pool. So there's some impatience there, and then you have the ongoing challenges of sex for you at home on YouTube. Next lifetime is in Persia. Now, you've heard of Persia, but did you know that it's actually Iran? It's the ancient name of Iran was Persia, and this is around 6,000 BCE, before Common Era. And the area, this literally is a picture of the city of the hills and plains. They're very close, the nearest major city to where Cayce indicated it was. So that's, if you think of it as just being swirling sand dunes, it wasn't that at all. Now, over here on this side, somebody actually had a picture in the Google Images vault of Yolt. And if you wind up seeing the spelling of that name, it's right there. U-H-J-L-D-T is Yolt. And so he was Yolt, Edgar Cayce was Yolt in that lifetime. And you see the same picture of these three again, where they show up. You have Edgar as Yolt, and then you wind up having his wife in that lifetime was this one. All right, remember his scribe or secretary, Gladys Davis Turner. And then there was a third person who was vying for his affection and often getting it, which is Gertrude Cayce right here. Her name was Inza. So he was Yolt. You have Inza right here. And then you have, I think her name was Ilya. Yeah, I have it down here. Ilya. So Yolt, Inza, Ilya. And Ilya was actually his wife in that particular time. One reason I have this picture of this woman right here, you are going to see her show up in more lifetimes just about than anyone else as far as weaving in and out of Cayce's past lives. Her name in this incarnation and as a contemporary with Edgar Cayce was Anne Holbein. I'm very lucky to have any pictures of her. I had to call Sidney Kirkpatrick. If you're familiar with Sidney, wrote probably the definitive biography on Cayce's life called Edgar Cayce, an American Prophet. And luckily, I emailed him and said, do you have any pictures of Anne Holbein? And suddenly I got tons. So I thank him for being able to provide that. Anyway, in this incarnation, actually, this is one that they kind of lived happily ever after. He had a normal lifespan. And what happened was he was born into the monarchy of the family at that time. But at 21, he went away to Egypt. Now remember, Egypt was like 12,000 years before. 6,000 years later, he comes back as Yolt, and as Yolt, he goes away to Egypt to learn everything about the mystery schools and all the stuff that he had established, the teachings that he established as Rata. And so he goes back to learn all of that, and he brings it back to what was largely a bunch of Bedouins that were really not well established at that time, and took all of that information that he had learned and created an industry, a city, if you will, that was rivaling Egypt at the time. So he really took to heart the things that he had put into practice back then and brought it together over into the city of the hills and plains. But there is no name for it. That's what they called it, the city of the hills and plains. So I'm not just saying I didn't know what it is. In this particular lifetime, as you can see from the quote there in the middle, this is where Cayce did his greatest work in being able to develop his psychic abilities. So you're able to go ahead and say, this is the lifetime having the greatest effect as Edgar Cayce, where he went not only to Egypt, but continued to develop the psychic abilities that he had that served him so well in the lifetime as Yolt and then later as Edgar Cayce. Now, the story that goes along with this is that he was going around trying to do good with the neighboring cities and villages that were around him. He was away one time, and one of his military guys decides, we're getting really big and we can be very proud of ourselves, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to go bother this neighboring big city over here, and I'm going to go kidnap the monarch's daughter over there, which he did. And good old Yolt comes back and goes, I can't believe you did that. They're preparing for war. We're now going to go to war with these people instead of winning them over with love and kindness, etc. So what does Yolt decide to do? He goes ahead and packs up by himself and goes over to make a plea for the city. When he gets there, he runs into his wife to be. She's just a woman that's over there at that time who is not very happy with who he is, being Yolt in the neighboring city. And so when he tells her, can you get me in to be able to talk to these people and we'll try to make reparations and all that, she goes, sure, turns him in and gets him thrown into prison. So that's a way to start out a marriage, isn't it? So now we have this going on, and she realizes, because he stands his ground in what he was trying to do, she goes, my people are handling this wrong, he is handling it right, and she helps him to escape. And so he escapes, and when they find out that he escaped and it was because of her, they took her and drop-kicked her out with 2 days' rations into the desert. Said, good luck, don't come back, you're probably going to die out there, yes, we know. Cayce psychically figures out this is going on, is able to go find her wandering in the desert, and gets with her, and they wind up finding shelter in a cave. He's going to go out and find food and water for them, which he did, but not before he winds up breaking his arm and almost losing his life, and he manages to get back in time to provide sustenance for her and him. And then they have this great vision of what they two together will be able to do and build the city of the hills and plains to being the thing that was fable later on. They actually lived regular lifetimes and lived happily ever after, except for the sex. That apparently there were a number of people, and he had trouble with fidelity back in that lifetime, but they all tended to get along. As a matter of fact, these two went a long way to being able to get along with each other because they found solace in being friends together with each other. Alvin?
Was the city of the hills and plains a city or the country?
It is, they didn't really have state lines that were right there, so all you could call it was really a very large city compared to anything else that was around it. Yeah, it was not an entire, you couldn't call it Iran because it literally is, I mean, this is the size of what it is right now. It's probably not far from the size that it was back then, but there were a lot fewer people populating the area at the time. So these two actually used that lifetime to be able to work out their differences and be able to work together much more closely, especially in the lifetime as contemporaries with Edgar Cayce.
Who was Anne Holbein in that lifetime?
Anne Holbein was she was an also-ran. I just bring her up because she was part of this as one of Cayce's cohorts on the side, and her name was Yelda in that particular life. So she's in there, but she didn't. The only reason that we have her in here at all is she's one of the people that had a past life regression that was able to fill in many of the details that you just heard me give right now. Interestingly enough, when it got into the details about how she got to, how Cayce and Gladys got together in that lifetime, she declined to go further. That had to come from other sources because her heart was broken that the man was no longer available to be married at that point. I'm glad you asked that because it does bring up some of the intrigue that goes along with this. Now, this is probably the most interesting as far as being able to understand things in history. Edgar Cayce was a gentleman by the name of Xenon, Xenon. It's around the 12th century BCE. Now remember, that's 1200. A lot of people would look at this and go, well, you went from 50,000 to 12,000 to 6,000 to 12. No, that's 1200 when it's the 12th century if you have trouble with the decimal point. All right. In this incarnation, he actually came in to be more of an artisan. He was more of the artistic type. He was even an engineer. And, it's thought that even though the lifetime that he had a dream that he was Pythagoras. If you know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that guy. He was more than just a mathematician. So he had a past life that was possibly one of his, but didn't necessarily have the impact here. But in this time, he was really somebody that was more of a chemist, a sculptor, an artisan, as it says in the quote right there. And the story of this goes right along with the Trojan War and explains so much of what we're not able to get necessarily from the story of Hector. Now, here's Anne Holbein again, who was actually Cayce's wife in that incarnation. It was kind of a forced wife. Here's a picture of Helen of Troy from a statue right there, but now let me give you the story of the Trojan War according to the Cayce readings. You remember, you think it's because Paris came along and stole Helen of Troy from Agamemnon, takes her back to Troy. That was the linchpin that everybody said, that's it, we're all doing it. Really what it had to do was having the rights and controls of the waterways between Europe and Asia Minor. But that was the real reason for the war, but because she got kidnapped, that's what really got everything going. So we have Paris, who is who was the son of the king of Troy, goes ahead and woos her and takes her with him back to Troy. And so all of the Greeks get together, Achilles, Ulysses, Ajax, all the names you remember from the Iliad and Odyssey, and went over to go ahead and get her back. And that was a 10-year war, if you remember. All right, so Anne Holbein fits into this because she was one of the ladies in waiting to Helen of Troy. When Paris runs with Helen of Troy, I don't know how you can, if you can imagine this, but the wealthy and the elite and the monarchy, she brings her entourage with her. They're going to follow her wherever she goes, whether they think it's right or not. And so Anne Holbein, in that incarnation, her name was Garcia. I know it sounds very Hispanic, but Garcia was her name at that time. And so Garcia is part of the entourage, and as soon as they show up in Troy, all of the ladies in waiting are being looked at with suspect. And of course, we don't want Greeks running around in our palace with our top people. What if they were to poison or have a knife or something like that? And so they booted them all out. They didn't boot them out of the city, but she was assigned to Edgar up there in the corner. Edgar was Xenon. Xenon had the soldierly responsibility of being in charge of the main gate for Troy. He was the gatekeeper. He was the guy. Even though wasn't his training, everybody became a soldier in the Trojan War. So now she's the unwilling wife of Xenon up there, and he was trying to be very nice to her, and she even tried to escape one time, and he says, get back in here, and you're not going anywhere. And so what she did instead was try to figure out how she could help her fellow Greeks on the outside. And what she did, because she had her own artistic ability, was she started drawing to-scale maps of what Troy looked like on the inside, right down to how big are the gates, how tall are the walls, so, where are the key positions, where are the weapons, where, etc. And so she would put these in maps and she would toss them over the wall, and the Greeks did in fact find the maps. Went back, and if you remember, Ulysses was able to take that information and develop the Trojan horse. Now, the Trojan horse was kind of an interesting development, because they said, all right, we're going to have to figure out a way to be able to get inside of this thing, have them not be able to detect us, and that they're going to want to bring it inside the gates instead of have the thing burned. That would have been bad if they were inside it and still did that. Well, because they made it just a hair bigger than the gates, what Anne Holbein, as Garcia, was running around in there saying, I'm from Greece. I know exactly what this is. This is an offering to Athena. And it's not meant as, they're out of here. And remember, that's what the story of the Trojan War was. They got in their boats and they left. And they kind of went out of sight, and that's all they did. But they were waiting to come back. And this Trojan horse was just a little bit too big to be able to get inside. So they had to start tearing down a little bit of the wall. And it said, look, if you think, why would they have made it this big if they'd have known it was too big to bring inside the gate? They wouldn't have done that. If they wanted us to bring it inside the gate, they would have made it smaller. This is fascinating stuff to me, that they actually came up with it, with the idea of making it just that much bigger. So they did, and immediately start trying to make the, reinforce the wall bigger, but it made it so it was a whole lot easier to open from the inside because they had to redo everything. And that's what happened. That particular, evening, they were able to go ahead and make sure that the gates were easier to open because they had a couple of other spies that were inside of the walls. Very old Greeks, by the way. Ancient Greeks that just looked like little old men that were able to get through the wall, and then they went over there and were able to open the gates because they didn't have these great big, security systems because of the modifications they'd had. Anyway, if you're fascinated with that, here's a guy. You may, if you know the background of the Edgar Cayce story in more contemporary times, his name is Morton Blumenthal. If you've heard that name and never got to see a face, that's him. He's a stockbroker in New York and a real financier of all of Cayce's works. In fact, came up with the majority of the money to be able to build the hospital that still stands as the headquarters for the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach today. Now, he had a past life reading. In fact, he had lots of readings. He had 400 plus readings. And one of his past lives was given as Achilles. And so there he is. There's Achilles. That's what he looks like when he's in his 1940s look. And he was one of the Greeks on the outside that was leading the people inside the Trojan horse. Now, how did they build the Trojan horse? The Trojan horse was huge, right? I mean, you were able to get like a dozen people inside of this thing, and they go, they're going to be able to tell if we're in there. So Ulysses went midway into the belly, put a false floor on the thing, or actually a real floor that they got on top of that, so that when they got big long sticks and started pounding on the belly of the horse, it sounded hollow inside. And they're going, okay, we're all right. Tear the wall wider, get the thing inside, and we're good to go. And then they were able to come out and do what the rest of the story was all about. Here's a gentleman. That picture there is an artist depiction of Hector. Now, if you remember Hector, he was the main guy that Achilles and this guy, I'm pretty sure they must have met in that lifetime. Remember, this Hector is Arthur Lammers. Arthur Lammers, if you know the story, you're familiar with that name, he was the one that first got Cayce off of doing physical readings and saying everything about, how to heal the physical body, and started asking spiritual questions about who are we, how do we get here, why did God create us, where are we going from here, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Arthur Lammers is the one that started asking all of those questions, and he happened to have been Hector. I don't know if they got along well or not in the current lifetime. There wasn't any information on that particular one. But by the way, she showed up in Cayce's current life as his wife. Just fascinating how we keep taking these major players and they come back together over and over and over again. So to recap, we take Edgar Cayce and he's Xenon. Then we take the Greek lady-in-waiting to her that wound up marrying Cayce by force, and that was Anne Holbein, whose name was Garcia. Then we take Morton Blumenthal, who was Achilles back in the Trojan War, and then we wind up having Arthur Lammers, who was Hector, and of course Helena Troy was Adeline Morton was the name. Morton, this will be a surprise, they got a divorce. So things didn't quite work out in the life that was more of a contemporary with Cayce. But fascinating story to see how they keep interacting. This is a fascinating lifetime just because of the way that Edgar Cayce was responding to it. This is Lucius Septulus of Cyrene. Some of you, if you happen to be Christian historians, know that in the first century, he was one of the people that was set up as they had like 70 disciples or bishops that were supposed to go out and spread Christianity throughout the known world at that point. So you wind up having Lucius of Cyrene, is what he was basically known as. And by the way, this is a statue of him. I think it's to this day still in the Vatican. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Andrew. There's Lucius of Cyrene right there. All right, so we have Lucius of Cyrene and that depiction right there. You have, I'm just going to give you the names of these people and we'll come back to them. This is a lady by the name of May St. Clair Gimbert who shows up in this particular story. That again is Gladys Davis Turner on the left. I'm going to mention the one on the right just because it'll be in a talk that I give months from now of just famous people that had Edgar Cayce readings. The one on the right, her name is Mildred Davis. She is a cousin to Gladys Davis and she was Mary Magdalene. So if you ever wonder what Mary Magdalene looked like, that's what she looked like in the 30s and 40s. Over here, you wind up having Andrew, which was his oldest son, and then you have Luke, who was his grandson. His grandson was born about, maybe 3 years or so before Edgar Cayce passed away, so he was able to get 5 or 6 readings. So all of these people are going to be players in this lifetime as Lucius of Cyrene. Now, I want you to take a look at this date. And the date is 1925, and they said during the, it's talking about at the time where Jesus was on the earth, what did they call Edgar Cayce in that incarnation? The answer then was Lucius. That's all they said. 12 years later, they told him it was Lucius of Cyrene. And they said, why didn't you let me know that it was Lucius of Cyrene? Because Edgar Cayce read the Bible more than once for every year that he was alive. So he read it 70 or more times. All right, and knowing that, he knew exactly who Lucius of Cyrene was. I think I probably have it written in there someplace. No, I don't show you where there are 2 Bible references that Lucius of Cyrene is actually mentioned by name within the Bible. I think one's in Romans and one in Acts. Anyway, you wind up having 12 years between these two. The reading's answer to that was fascinating. It said, because if you'd have known you were a Lucius of Cyrene in 1925, it would have puffed you up. Like egotistically. Now, here's a guy that could be told that you've been around, you were a big leader in Atlantis, you were Ra, the sun god, you were Yolt in the city of the hills and plains. None of that puffs him up. Tell him he's Lucius of Cyrene when you're raised as a born-again disciples of Christ Christian, and suddenly you've now found the weak spot for him. So it took 12 years until he wound up having the maturity, if you will, spiritual maturity, to not have the ego get the better of him and letting him know that he was actually Lucius of Cyrene at that point. All right, now, how did Lucius of Cyrene interact? Obviously, he's going to be interacting with Andrew and with Luke right there, but let me get into this. It's not a long story, but as far as how these other people come into play. There is a lady in here that was his wife by the name of Mariah. I know that's what the name of the wind is, but it was that was the name of his wife in the lifetime of Lucius of Cyrene. And so he wound up having a wife, and then he wound up having other people that that he was involved with. And certainly this is the first time we run into May St. Clair. I was lucky enough when I served on the national board for the ARE back from 85 to 90, she was still on the board, still alive, I would sit next to her. She was a kick. I really liked that lady. And in fact, the readings really described her as having the ability to wrap men around her little finger. In almost every lifetime she ever had, it said, that it was a problem for her that she had this ability and didn't always use it well. So she was just a spitfire, I got to tell you. A lot of fun. So she was one of the people that caused the sex problems in that particular incarnation. My ratings went up again. And so you have the wife of Maria. Her, by the way, her name was Eleanor Morrow, and I didn't have a picture of her, and I didn't ask Sydney for one. And May St. Clair was a woman who he had 2 children with in that lifetime by the name of Vesta. And I think the kids actually had contemporary lifetimes with him as well. So yeah, it's ongoing as far as his inability to remain faithful within the lifetimes that he had right there. Ralph Dahl. This is one that very few people pay any attention to when it comes to the past lives of Edgar Cayce. I'm not really sure how much of an impact it had because he didn't live to be over 5 years old. He only lasted to be 5. This is in 16th century France. I don't know if you know the pictures of the people. This is King Louis XIV. All right, so you have what, Marie Antoinette and all of that. He had a kid, actually more than one, King Louis XV, who's depicted here. And if you're getting used to seeing Gladys Davis Turner over there, she was a daughter that King Louis had had in that lifetime. So she and he were siblings. Now, this is in France, right? She goes ahead and has relations with somebody over in England and has a child. Now, the problem is that the child is now Edgar. That's the boy, and the boy's name is Ralph Dahl. If that doesn't sound like a French name, you can guess he didn't come from France, and therein lay the problem. So you wind up having this, you have problems with the English, and so you wind up having this man being the monarch that took over for King Louis XIV, saying, you have somebody that's potentially an heir to the throne that came from England. That's not good, if you understand how those things work. And they literally took the child away from the mother. I want to say the kid was 3. Edgar Cayce was 3 in that lifetime, and his mother she, get thee to a convent, whatever that line was out of Shakespeare. She literally got sent to a convent and then found out that her child had died of neglect pretty much 2 years after that, and she died of her own neglect of herself. I think she died at age 30 in that particular lifetime. So I'm not sure what the tremendous impact was in that particular lifetime on the current lifetime as Cayce, but this is one of the 7 lifetimes that was given. I think it has to do with, abandonment issues and things like that, it seems to come up, like when Gladys Davis was the child back in Ratah's day that had to be left behind when Gertrude and Cayce got evicted for 9 years. So Ralph Dahl, 16th century France. And now we have probably one of the more interesting lifetimes of Edgar Cayce. This is John Bainbridge. Now, I'll tell you, if you were to go back and look at the readings, it's entirely possible to think there were 2 incarnations as Bainbridge. I do not think there were 2. I think there was one, and that he happened to have been born later in the 16th century and lived on into the 17th, yes. So he was born in the later 16th century in the 1500s and lived on into the 17th century or the 1600s. And so when they mention that, some people try to put 100 years between them. No, it's all the same lifetime, just like we are now in a different century than we were all born in, right? So I think that answers this. You're getting used to seeing Anne Holbein. There again is May St. Clair. And this is a military outpost called Fort Dearborn. You probably know it today as Chicago. And that was pretty much where I think Cayce spent a lot of his time, because he was, he'd started over there in England. By the way, there's some intimation, I can't guarantee this, but as I was going through trying to track all this down, believe me, you could put one of those conspiracy theories of people's pictures up there with yarn and all of that, trying to connect all this stuff. I think King Louis XV was his grandfather, as John Bainbridge. I can't guarantee that, but I mean, I was reading and going, if I could nail that down a little tighter, I'd say it more confidently, but it seems like that was probably true. All right, so this was not a great lifetime for Edgar Cayce as John Bainbridge, because he used his psychic abilities for nefarious purposes, specifically gambling. Anybody want to play poker with a guy that knows what every card in the deck is? I wouldn't. And he could do really well with that. And again, he was a ladies' man in his travels. Probably the most infamous one that came up was he ran into, actually he was kidnapped by Indians, and he was saved from being killed by an Indian princess that took a liking to him, and they spent some time together. Then he took all of her wealth and left. I don't think she liked that much. I don't know who she was. I don't think the reading said, but I'll bet it's somebody that, I could get a picture for at some point, but I don't actually know from the readings who that was. As a matter of fact, they said that was really a bad lifetime for him, except at the very end, there was an attack by Indians, and they were trying to escape down a river, and people had been washed overboard, and he helped this woman get back up onto the raft and lost his life in the effort. And it said that his willingness to give up his own life to be able to save her life meant that the entity gained in that lifetime. So that was the saving grace for him, even though he had been doing so badly up to that point. Here's the interesting part, is that Anne Holbein winds up being his daughter. And that now, apparently, as John Bainbridge, he got to know a lot of women. As May St. Clair was one of them. In Fort Dearborn, I think she worked in a bordello, and that was where they got acquainted. But she was not the mother. The mother of Anne Holbein at that point was just another, lady at that time who didn't last very long after Anne was born. The reason that we know, even in history, that she was the daughter is she was given the name of Mary Bainbridge. So I think it was pretty clear everybody knew who she belonged to in that lifetime. And John Bainbridge just took off. Cayce took off, and she was being, taken care of in a more or less a bordello, a tavern, until the thing burned down. And then she's going to be thrown out in the street. Well, John Bainbridge shows up again and actually takes her down to Virginia. And in Virginia, he sets her up, one of these wealthy plantation owners, as being one of the servants that works in there. And the way that it gets described is that he knew people that were really, really well connected, high politically, wealthy, and they all knew who he was. They all respected him, but they didn't want anybody else to know that they knew him. That was the way that the relationships were described. So everybody knew he was a bad guy, but apparently he was able to have some friends in high places. Problem is all they did was they took the girl, they had her working down in the cellars, and she wound up getting, I don't know, what do they call it, coal miner's lung or something like that, and she died very early, probably around 14, 15, not even 20 years old. Oh, no, died at 14, as in that lifetime. So she didn't last very long, and John Bainbridge, I told you how he died in the rafting. So we now have 7 of lifetimes that had the greatest effect on Cayce's current lifetime as Edgar Cayce. You see a lot of pictures up here right now of Edgar Cayce's friends, past and present, and I will go through each one of these pictures just briefly to let you know. This is supposed to be Achilles, and that, again, is Morton Blumenthal, so these are supposed to be one and the same. Now, if you go horizontally here for a second, and you want to talk about this is probably the 2 most famous lifetimes attributable to only one soul that I've ever seen outside of Edgar himself. You remember that person? Thomas Jefferson? That's not really Alexander the Great, that's Colin Farrell. But, but it was as close as I could get to a picture of Alexander the Great that people would recognize. And that is one soul who is still alive today on this earth plane, who is both of those people. I'll get to that later on. His name is T.J. Davis, as in Thomas Jefferson, and as in Alexander the Great. This is another picture of Anne Holbein. You've been hearing me give you her name over and over again. She was actually in a play as a actress at that point, so she's in that getup. This picture you've seen before, where you have Gladys Davis Turner, the stenographer, and her cousin, who is Mary Magdalene. These are the people we're about to be able to discuss. Well, actually not her. How many of you are in a study group, in a Cayce study group? If you recognize that picture, that's Esther Wynn, who was the one who wrote the Search for God books, largely as the compiler of all the notes and did the first drafts of putting things together. Anybody recognize that gentleman? That's Harold J. Riley. Harold J. Riley is an MD doctor that Cayce started referring people to go to even before they met.
I met him.
Did you? Yeah, he died, I think, in the 80s or something. Yeah, you were in New York? New Jersey. This is a picture. It's very rare to see pictures of him. That's David Kahn. So if you're used to knowing this Cayce story, and I'll come back to him, but David Kahn and Cayce in there, this is a lady by the name of Elsie Sechrist. If you're into Cayce books, she wrote Dreams, Your Magic Mirror, which is probably a bestseller, definitive book from the Cayce perspective of how to do dream interpretation. So I'm going to cover mainly the people on the bottom row there as we go forward to finish this up. That's Morton Blumenthal, and yet another picture of Achilles. Okay, it's Brad Pitt. But but what the heck, it is Achilles in that particular movie right there. All right, so here's where, if you like to get in and do all this kind of research, Morton Blumenthal, his reading number, remember they try to keep you anonymous. These people are long dead, so I don't think they're going to come back and sue me. So we have Morton Blumenthal. If you look up his number that they use in the readings, is 900. This man had more readings than anyone else. Remember, Cayce himself only had 212 readings. He had 468 of them. So that was a lot. Okay, so you can see where he had similar incarnations with Cayce, certainly in Egypt. That's Rata, the Holy Land, as in Lucius of Cyrene. And again, he was Achilles in the Trojan War. So again, he was the major financier of the Cayce Hospital, and closed a couple of years after it was open. I think it was 1956 when they finally reacquired that building after losing it in 1931. Oh, I do have the quote down there. In the next return, saying his, talking about it in a past life reading, it says, in the next return, we would find the body through its will and spirit force need not be in the earth's plane again. So that's what it looks like when Cayce says of one of the 18, because there were 18 people, 19 if you count Cayce, who didn't need to come back into the earth. And there it is. This is Anne Holbein again. You're able to see Anne Holbein and her husband in this particular picture. And again, you've been used to seeing that one through the whole thing. But she was around, she had at least 4 lifetimes that went in and around Cayce when he was Yolt, when he was Xenon, Bainbridge, and back in the Rata and Holy Land period as well. So even though she didn't get a name and her specific interaction with him at that particular time, she was around, what? That's 5 lifetimes right there. Here's an interesting one, just if you want to throw a tidbit. Like I said, Morton was one of the 18 that didn't have to come back. This woman, back in the time of Yolt, invented sunglasses. If you think you'd need them when you're around here in Arizona, imagine when you have that wind whipping around that desert sand and the not being able to have the UV protection. So she was the first one to come up with sunglasses. They would make leather straps that would go around across, and they would have this kind of, I don't know what do you call the kind of crystal that comes off in flakes? And that's mica, yeah, kind of like that. And she said apparently they had some kind of material that would flake off like that, and they would make sunglasses out of it. Anyway, she was the older sister of Yolt at that time, and was able to invent that. Gladys Davis Turner, her reading number is 288. She had 55 Cayce readings. And I took an actual quote from her herself as opposed from her reading, because she was asked by Just Stern in that Intimates Through Time, you know, it sounds like you were very close to Edgar Cayce. And a lot of people were thinking, yeah, you guys had so much sex in those past lives. How about this incarnation? And apparently I'll get into that, but she came back, Cayce came back into the lifetime with Gertrude as his wife and Gladys Davis as the stenographer to be able to work on that specifically. So why shouldn't I feel close to Mr. Cayce? I was his wife, Ilya, in the one life as Yolt, his daughter, Iso, in another as Rata, and his mother is now here's the interesting thing about when you take shorthand. She couldn't tell whether her name was Agatha or Gracia in that particular life. I guess when you're taking shorthand, either one could have worked for the jot she put down. So as his mother and still another, when he was that 5-year-old kid, Ralph Dahl in France. And don't forget Atlantis when they were soulmates as Azul. So you have to say, why in the world wouldn't you feel close to somebody that you had that kind of interaction with in all that period of time? By the way, she never married until Cayce had passed away in 1945, and then she married twice. She was hard on husband. She was widowed twice by them. As another one, I was lucky enough to, my mother was such a foundation on the West Coast for the Edgar Cayce readings, so we got to always have Hewlett and Cayce had a tremendous impact on my life, and Gladys Davis would stay at our house, and she was in the area, and so I got to know these people when they were alive and kicking here on the earth. Now we have Gertrude Evans Cayce. There's not nearly as much information on her with Edgar, but here, let's take a look at it. She's reading number 538. She had 72 Cayce readings, almost all of them about health. She is a very frail woman. But she did share several lives with Edgar. She was with him in Rata, when he was Rata, as Isis in Egypt. And remember, when he was Yolt, she was Inza in Persia. Interestingly enough, she was the daughter of Socrates. Just happened to come up in one of the readings, had nothing to do with a past lifetime with Cayce, but I just kind of throw that in there to let you know, yeah, there were other, connections with famous people. Here's another one that doesn't come up in here very much, but Hewlett and Cayce was just absolutely enamored with his mother. He just loved his mother, and she loved him. And the reason being is that they were together, I believe, as husband and wife back in the time of Alfred the Great. Did anyone ever watch the History Channel show Vikings? If you, my wife she loved that show. Anyway, if you were to look at it, Alfred the Great was like the king of England, a good portion of England at that time, and the Vikings came over, and got into a whole big, hullabaloo with them. And actually it was Edgar in that lifetime, as I believe the second son, that finally came to peaceable terms after they kept killing each other back and forth over and over. But that was where Hewlett and Gertrude got together and developed such a strong bond. Then there's Hewlett and Cayce. His number is 341. He had 53 Cayce readings. And again, he was Andrew the Apostle back in the lifetime as Lucius, and with Ra as King Ararat. That's how they oftentimes, this is the spelling that was given by Cayce for how it was supposed to have been back then. I believe they take out a couple of the A's when you have it in the current history books. All right, so this is what Hewlett looked like as Edgar Cayce's son. This is what he looked like as Andrew, and of course that's Ramses. Who knows if it looked like that or not? They all kind of look the same when they're in that big statue mode, right? And, I'm making the note there of Alfred the Great and making peace with the Vikings and all that. May Gimbert St. Clair. She reading number is 1523, and she had 17 Cayce readings. Question came up during the break of how many readings, did it take to put all of this together. If you assume that there were probably 2 or 3 readings from each one of these people that were coming out. So if you have a couple of readings from Edgar, and you have 2 or 3 from May St. Clair, and you have a couple from Gertrude, and you have a couple more, well, actually, that's Sally Cayce. That's Hewlett Cayce's wife. I don't know how I got her in there, but she was an important part of his life, that's for sure. So you wind up having all of these people in their life readings being able to fill in the pieces and parts. And remember that in particular, Anne Holbein was the one that kept having the past life regressions from Just Stern, and in her past life regression memory, she was able to fill in a lot of information here. Oh yeah, I told you she was able to wrap other like men around her finger in all of her lifetimes, and kept warning her to make sure that she made the good use of it rather than just to her own purposes. David Kahn. This was a very important man in Cayce's life. If you follow his biography, he met him, I believe, when he was about 15 years old. When David Kahn was 15, Cayce was older. Met him in Kentucky, and the first readings that he had were even before Cayce did past life readings. I mean, it happened early enough that Cayce wasn't doing past life readings yet, and so he was doing health readings for him. And then he found out about the metaphysical or life readings, as they called them, and he started becoming the greatest, what do you want to say, PR guy or marketing guy to be able to bring people on to Cayce of anybody that ever worked with him. So notably, he was, if you've ever followed the American Revolution, he was an aide to General Howe, who is one of the famous generals that won us our independence from Great Britain back in the day. But he followed Cayce's advice and became a very wealthy guy in the furniture business. And if you're familiar with his background, as far as the oil well time, there were a couple of years in which they went trying to use Cayce's abilities to find oil. They found oil. They could never drill down deep enough to hit it. And he was the one that went with him and financed it, and ultimately it didn't work out. And I'll come into why that didn't work out in a minute. Dr. Harold J. Riley, he was a medical doctor. 438 was his number. He had 6 Cayce readings, but he was a very interesting guy in that he was already been through med school, and he starts getting referrals that are coming to him with it was a Cayce reading that were saying, you know, do these osteopathic adjustments and have them take this concoction, put this poultice on, do these kind of exercises. And Harold Riley is going, yeah, that actually makes sense to him. Well, he had been working in the temples of sacrifice in the Temple Beautiful back in Rata's time as one of his main, you know, adjutants, if you will, that was trying to help to be able to heal people and all. So they had a real tight relationship back in the Egyptian times, and Cayce was already recommending people to go over to him. It was Riley himself was trained, by his own estimation, at least 300 other doctors in the Cayce modalities, if you will. He didn't say this is all metaphysical information that came from this psychic dude over here. He would just go ahead and say this is the Harold J. Riley approach to nutrition. This is how you take care of, you know, do these exercises, these adjustments, this nutrition, etc. And trained about 300 different people to carry that kind of work on. He was already like a doctor to the stars. If you're reading the notes right there, he was already a doctor to Bob Hope and Jack Dempsey, if you remember those 2 names in the past. So he was a pretty big guy out there in the New York area. These, again, Bill, and I don't have a picture of Bill in here, but Elsie Sechrist, I told you she had written a book called Dreams, Your Magic Mirror. They were their main lifetime with Edgar Cayce. They had 4 readings each, by the way, and each of them had a different 2982 and 2981 as far as the reading numbers assigned to keep them anonymous. So they worked with him in the days when he was Yolt. And Elsie was a prophetess and had a particular talent for working with, of all things, dreams. And of course, she was getting ready to, I forget what kind of a venture she was going into, but Cayce, in a dream, came to her and said, stop doing whatever you're doing and start writing a book on dreams. And it became the bestseller, Dreams, Your Magic Mirror. So she had a habit of working with Cayce. Even when he was alive, he had this psychic connection with her that she could just go to sleep, not set an alarm, and she would wake up at 2 o'clock, not because she could wake up, but because Cayce came and woke her up. Out of a sound sleep, she'd just be awake, and then she would go meditate at 2 o'clock in the morning. Al Thornton likes to do that. Of course, he's as crazy as she is. No, so trying to do that 2 a.m. meditation. Actually, I remember giving a story one time that she didn't wake up until it was 2:20 in the morning. And she was going, oh my gosh, I've missed the entire meditation. But she got up and she meditated anyway. Everything felt right. She goes back to sleep, sees Cayce later on and mentions that, and he goes, no, I'm afraid it was me that overslept. And didn't wake her up until 2:20 that particular morning. Just funny to see how the connection is with that. She is probably one of the people that listened to him closer than anything else. For instance, Morton Blumenthal did not listen to Cayce telling him that the Great Depression was coming and to get out of the stock market. And that was one thing that hurt him financially quite a bit. Elsie, on the other hand, I think they wound up with like $5,000 in cash, which back in the day, in the 50s, was, and by the way, Cayce has already died in 1945. So if she's got $5,000 in the 50s, that's a lot of money. And I don't know if they came to it by an inheritance or what, but they were getting ready to put it into a certificate of deposit or something like that. And Cayce comes to her in a dream and says, invest in Virginia Beach real estate, which, of course, back then was just this podunk, sandy kind of summer town that people came and visited instead of being the resort city that it is now. And they wound up becoming, she and Bill became very wealthy by following that advice and continuing to do Virginia Beach real estate investments all that time. It allowed them to not only retire early, but these two went to every single location that they went to the city of the hills and plains and would meditate and have past life memories of being in the area together, even as husband and wife back then. Fascinating couple. All right, I have honorable mentions here. You remember I talked about Yolt had one of his military guys that decided when Yolt was gone that he'd go out there and kidnap the monarch's daughter? That's him. He got to know who he was in Cayce's life. His name was Thomas B. Brown. Reading number 195, his name was pronounced Weda, the military commander who kidnapped the neighboring city's queen. So, Yolt had a pretty tough time trying to get over what that guy unilaterally decided to go out there and do, but they got along, Tom House and he got along very well in the lifetime of Edgar Cayce. I told you about T.J. Davis in the other picture. There he is just as a little kid back in the, I think it was the early 40s when he was born. Alexander the Great, Thomas Jefferson, being from him. And of course, now we have Mildred Davis, 295, as a cousin to Gladys Davis. And that's a picture, some artist depiction of Mary Magdalene.
And who is TJ related to?
Oh, TJ, I'm sorry. That's the nephew of Gladys Davis Turner. This is Gladys Davis Turner's nephew. And she wound up actually having to care for him. In fact, a little anecdote on the side, she was taking dictation of a reading. And Cayce was giving a reading at the time. She looked out the window and could see, just young little TJ, who was probably 4 years old, if that, wandering along and was heading toward a brook that was, outside of the house where they were. And she's trying to take the thing down, and her attention's trying to make sure that her charge is not going to be harmed in doing that. And all of a sudden, Cayce in the middle of it says, "Go get the child." He's in an altered state, just lying there in the bed, says, "Go get the child," and she hadn't said a word. She just set everything down, went out, got him, brought him back in, and the reading picked up as if it had never stopped when she got sat down and was ready to go again. So, yeah, there's quite a connection with all these folks. And as I said, he's still alive. He's probably 85, 86 now. Here's do you remember where Thomas Jefferson had set up his home in Virginia? It was called Monticello. Do you know that he actually had a job as the groundkeeper for Monticello? I mean, he's obviously retired now, but it was just interesting as TJ Davis.